Thank you for watching this video from the Center for European Studies at Carleton University. This event was organized by the Center for European Studies and Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue, and supported by Carleton University and by grants from the European Union and Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The views expressed in this video are solely those of the presenter and do not reflect the views of the European Union, Center for European Studies, and Carleton University.
Hello, so thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Braun from Metropolitan University. So what I would say will relate to quite some degree to what Dr. Hayes said during the first session of today and to what was mentioned also during the second panel. I will try to discuss a little bit about the relationship between the popular support for climate policy in Europe and the question of why European Union has become a kind of leader, at least within the field of climate policy. It is kind of an unlikely leader, if you would see it from a perspective that in a governance form, such as the European Union, you have several possible veto points that could block decisions regarding a progressive climate policy. So the question is a little bit here, and that is what relates to Dr. Hayes' presentation previously today, is the question is about what happened in 2008, because that was kind of a milestone for the development of internal climate policy in the European Union. So the question is, how come that the European Union at that time adopted a quite ambitious climate and energy package? And what are the differences between the situation back then in 2008 and the situation today in 2015 or in 2014 when we had the framework for 2030 being agreed to? If we just have a brief look at the public opinion, using figures from the Eurobarometer. Eurobarometer tends to ask Europeans their views about issues related to what the European Union does with regular intervals. And one of the questions which has been asked is one of how many people would state climate change as the main environmental worry. And as we will see here, back in 2003 we had 39% of the respondents stating that. In 2007 this increased to 57%, to go back again in 2011 to 34%. Thereafter, this particular question has not been asked, but other questions, such as a question of respondents identifying the single most serious problem facing the world, shows also a kind of declining attention paid to climate change as a challenge to our societies. And this is not to say that Europeans would not be as interested, would not be ignorant of climate issues, because more than 50% still consider it to be one of the most important issues to tackle regarding global challenges to the world. But if you would see it compared to what was going on 10 years ago, we still can talk about a change in the public opinion. And the question is now, how does the public opinion relate to European Union politics? How does it relate to EU climate policy? I would make an argument that it is related to EU climate policy and the work of the European Commission that might seem unlikely to several of you. I mean, European Commission being often viewed as a technocratic body with civil servants being fairly remote from the citizens and not paying all that much attention to what would be the trend in the public opinion at the moment. But if we look at what happened shortly before the climate and energy package was adopted in 2008, we can see that it's related to public opinion, but it's not necessarily completely related to climate change in the first place. Rather, my argument is that it's a lot about the European Union itself. But just this is a recapitulation about what you heard earlier. Why is this 2008 such a milestone? Why is the climate and energy package such a milestone? Dr. Hay mentioned the targets the 2020 targets earlier, so we'll just go briefly through this. But the most important part of actual legislative text that were adopted in 2008 and then later completely in 2009 was the revision of the Emission Trading Directive, actually introducing a central cap on the levels of emissions, which actually centralized this system compared to what we had previous to that. We also had a very important effort-sharing decision, which included national targets for non-ETS sectors. We had the binding national targets for renewable energy sources. And we had a directive on carbon capture. And just briefly mentioning this, it has been mentioned before today, in order to know why we're talking about this as a milestone in EU climate policy. Basically, we can say from this point we can talk of the European Union having an internal policy being comparable ambitious as external commitments. But what then would be, and why would be a particular interest of the European Commission in the issue of climate change at this time? And my argument here is, as I said, it has a lot to do about the European Union as such, and perhaps less about climate in the first place. That is, you had, at the time, after the Maastricht Treaty was agreed to and signed and came into force in 1993, you had a period of discussion that the European Union has moved beyond what was normally described previously as a permissive consensus between the citizens and the political elite driving the integration process further. And the argument was you need to get citizens more involved in EU affairs. The answer to this was not to go into the field of climate policy. The answer to this was expected to be the constitutional treaty, the treaty establishing a constitution for Europe. It was something which was called for by European leaders at the Laeken Declaration in 2001, and you had a convention on the future of Europe. You had lengthy negotiations leading up to a new treaty proposal being negotiated. It was a treaty which was supposed to be very different compared to previous treaty revisions, in the sense that it was not supposed to be a treaty revision. It was supposed to be a new treaty replacing all the old ones. And it was supposed to be more inclusive. But it ended up with a failure. You had a rejection of that treaty in France and in the Netherlands in 2005. And you have a question of how to move the European integration project further at this time. You had the Commissioner Margaret Wallström issuing a Plan D, D standing for a plan for democracy, dialogue and debate, to increase the debate between the European Commission and the citizen in order to increase the acceptance for the European Union among its citizens. But there was not very much actual output of that. And at the same time, we had, as was discussed earlier today, the issue, we had the Stern report coming. There was a lot of talk about climate change. And as you saw, there was a lot of concerns about climate among the European populations. So it was a very topical issue for EU leaders to approach. And I would argue that the European Commission here played a crucial role in articulating the targets for the climate and energy package, and actually for especially focusing on the centralization of the emission trading system, which became the flagship, if you want to say, of EU climate policy. Of course, the reason why it came there is also linked to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol, with the European Union signing up to this as a bloc. And then you have, even if it's remained as a shared competence between the Commission and the Member States never took the step of allowing the Commission to negotiate on their behalf regarding climate policy. You can see a difference there between climate and trade negotiations, if you may. But still, it's something which served to emphasize that the Commission could take a different stand on the issue and more of a lead on the issue. So the question here is then, was the role of supranational institutions strengthened by the Climate and Energy Package of 2008. And as I already mentioned, yes, when it comes to the ETS, there was the EU-wide emission cap, which replaced previous national allocation plans, which was enhancing the role of this as a centralized system rather as a more decentralized system, and was also enhancing the role of the European Commission in administrating this. And you can also argue in a wider sense that the ETS in the first place reflects preference for market-based solutions, which you have found to a stronger degree within the European Commission than among the member states. And of course, when we have already heard a lot about renewable energy in the European Union during the previous panel, but you have this turn from non-binding to binding national targets, and as you know already, we know in the period after 2020 we return to non-binding national targets in combination with a binding EU target, which is something I will return to later on in this presentation, what would be the consequences of this. So far, my argument has been that you can see a linkage here between popular support, popular interest in the issue, and activities taken by the supranational body, the European Commission. What about then public opinion in the European Union and the member states? And what about the differences between attitudes in different EU member states? I hope you can see this map, which I borrowed from the Eurobarometer, the latest one on climate policy, or on attitudes to climate change, sorry. This is based on field work from 2013. What is interesting with this map, which asks the question of which of you following do you consider to be the most serious problem facing the world as a whole? And the respondents here could choose more than one answer. But you can see here that you have quite expected countries where you would have a strong concern for climate, that they would mention this as one of the most serious problem facing the world. You have Sweden, you have Denmark, you have Germany, you have Austria, you have Finland. And this relates to something, to a term which was discussed during the previous panel, and that is the concept of Europeanization. The question is here, because you can talk about a few countries as having been the countries driving EU climate policy to some degree, in combination, of course, with the European Commission, trying to upload their preferences to the EU level. And then the question is, what about the downloading of these policies then to the other countries? Of course, popular opinion does not say anything about adaptation to concrete policies and the adoption of concrete policies. But often in the literature discussing Europeanization, you have a wider assumption that this Europeanization process can lead also to a more transformation, not only of the policies implemented, but also on the actual priorities, preferences of those countries and societies in a larger sense. And just this map is just an illustration of this, where you still seem to have a few countries where this is a very big issue, and other countries where this is less of an issue. To be fair, you could also look at different questions. Different questions are being asked. For instance, the EU's approach to climate policy is often argued to be based on ecological modernization, or, to make it easier, on the assumption that you can view climate change as an economic opportunity as well, as has already been mentioned here today. And if you would ask the question if the population, if respondents do believe that if population do believe that a transition to a low-carbon economy could be beneficial for the economy, you find slightly different results. But you would still, for instance, you will have surprisingly few respondents in the Netherlands actually believing in this hypothesis. But you will still have approximately in the same countries a stronger support for that. You will have a strong support for that also in Spain. But what you would still have is an East-West divide over this issue. That is different ways of understanding and framing the issue in some of the northwestern member states compared to several of the member states in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, there are different potential outcomes of a process driven by Europeanization. You can talk about inertia, absorption, transformation, retrenchment. To put that in simpler words, you can talk about the countries largely ignoring what is going on. You can talk about formal absorption. You can talk about complete transformation of preferences, or you can talk of retrenchment, meaning that the previous resistance to the issue driven by the European Union is actually rather emphasized by the attempt of the European Union to drive the issue. And if we would look at climate policy, we can find a little bit of here. We can, just to be very brief on this point, when it comes to the retrenchment here, we have had a lot of resistance to climate policy at the EU level, coming from politicians also being defined as Eurosceptics. You can see that in the case of Poland previously, during Kaczynski's governance. You can see that in the Czech Republic through the example of Václav Klaus, who was for a long time the president. That is, in such conditions, the question is how far can you actually at the European level promote such a change of preferences on an issue such as climate policy, and could such attempts also be counterproductive? But I know I have very little time, so I will try to just sum up my conclusions and skip some parts here. The question is then, what about the intergovernmental level on the negotiations in 2008? How come it was possible to find a comparatively ambitious deal that time, given that we had relatively divergent, not only popular preferences, but also preferences among the politicians? There has been some talk in the literature about a rhetorical entrapment, referring to that the EU norms would have been that strong that the countries being reluctant would not be willing to go against that norm. I'm not that convinced about that. You have also had discussion about a slight unwillingness to go against the interest of France and Germany. We shouldn't forget here in this context that the targets for 2020 were broken up during a German council presidency, and the actual final negotiations on the climate and energy package took place under a French council presidency, and the French government was very much going, I will be very brief to conclude, going in the direction of that they really wanted to have a compromise being made. And we just go to the last point here. The Central and East European member states at the time still being relatively new. There has been assumptions in the EU literature that when a member state gets into the EU, it would be more willing to cast negative votes or go against a decision in the Council. That was based on experiences from enlargement in the 1990s. But with the enlargement in 2004 and 2007, it actually seems that these countries, when they accessed, were less willing to go against the majority opinion than that they have been so far. And that is something which you can also have a look at through statistics on voting in the Council. This is what was negotiated in 2014. You have already heard a lot about this before today. So I will just move on to the final slide here instead, and which is just a reflection here. If we are moving in the direction of more differentiated integration in the field of climate policy. Differentiated integration is kind of a a relatively trendy word in the study of European integration. You argue that the European Union can move on in different speeds in different parts of Europe, in different policy fields. You have such an example when it comes to the common currency. The question is, how far is that possible when it comes to climate policy? We have the renewable energy targets here as a case in point, where you have the talk of a new governance system which should be in place to make sure that the EU can have one goal at the EU level, binding such, and non-binding goal at the national level. The question is, can that lead to something? But we are also, this is my last point, I promise, the role of the European Council when it comes to climate policy. If you would go and look at the agreement from 2014, you find the formulation there that the European Council will keep all the elements of a framework under review and will continue to give strategic orientations with respect to consensus on ETS, non-ETS interconnection and energy efficiency. Well, that doesn't sound too spectacular, but it actually is, because the European Council would demand decision taken by consensus on those issues. Whereas if you leave it to the normal decision-making procedure, you actually have decision by qualified majority voting in the Council, meaning that you're actually going more in the direction of more intergovernmental decision-making on that point. Sorry for taking longer time than I should, and thank you for your attention.